So, welcome to lesson 1.3, which is a history of theoretical history. So, let's start with a timeline. And I'll divide this into three parts. I'll label this 200 BC, AD 1800, the year 2000, and for a round number, the year 2020. And you can see that this covers 20 years, this covers 200 years, and this covers 2000 years. So this is a logarithmic scale. It goes up in equal ratios rather than in equal steps. And we'll populate this with some of the key figures in theoretical history. So we can start here in 200 BC with Polybius, who was a Greek historian who developed a theory of political cycles. He said that governments always go through a certain series of forms in a particular order and then loops back to the beginning. And moving forward a bit to the 14th century, we have Ibn Khaldun, who was an Arab historian who set out to write a history of the world. And he wrote an introduction to his history in which he set forward his own theory of history, which was particularly about the theory of dynastic cycles, how dynasties start off well and then gradually decline and fall. And then in the 18th century, this was the time of the French Enlightenment, and we have a group of people I'll call the physiocrats, who were impressed with the work that Isaac Newton had done in the natural sciences and thought, well, let's try and do what Newton did for the social and historical sciences. So they were trying to develop laws of social and economic behaviour and laws of historical change. And then in the early 19th century, we have Auguste Comte, the sociologist. This was a time when governments were becoming increasingly bureaucratic and collecting lots of statistics about their populations. And so Comte was taking advantage of this, looking at these statistics and analysing the numbers and looking for patterns in the statistics. And then in the mid-19th century, we have Marx, who was responsible for a theory of history that, of course, many people follow today, Marxism, and he combined his development of his theory with political activism. And then in the 20th century, we have Arnold Toynbee, a British historian who was active in the 30s and 60s and wrote a multi-volume work called A Study of History, in which he set out his theory of civilizations and how civilizations, of which Western civilization is just one example, tend to follow a definite pattern. And also in the 1960s, we have the discovery of the demographic hyperbola. This is the fact that if you plot the population of the world against time, so plotting the growth of world population, it lies very close to a mathematical curve known as a hyperbola. And so this is an indication that in the historical sciences, in the social sciences, we can find mathematical patterns that are just as close and just as precise as we find in disciplines like physics and chemistry. And this discovery of the mathematical hyperbola has, in world population growth, has stimulated a lot of the more recent work in theoretical history to explain why this occurs and then to build on that. And in the 1990s, we have Jack Goldstone with his structural demographic theory. This was about the outbreak of revolutions like the English Civil War and the French Revolution. And what Jack Goldstone did was develop quantitative metrics of social unrest and the factors leading to social unrest. And so he showed that the revolutions broke out just at the time when his metrics reached their peak. So this was showing that we can study things that people have traditionally studied verbally, like the English Civil War, in a quantitative mathematical way. And then in 2003, we have Peter Turchin's book, Historical Dynamics. And one of the things he did was take Jack Goldstone's structural demographic theory and show how it can be turned into mathematical equations that show the dynamic behaviour of the variables that Jack Goldstone was picking out, why they evolve in a certain way towards a crisis. And in 2006, the Russian researcher Andrei Korotayev and some of his colleagues brought out a series of books, Social Macrodynamics, in which they particularly looked at this demographic hyperbola and presented the theory as to why it occurs, and then built on that to talk about things like, again, the outbreak of revolutions and developing mathematical models of those. And also in 2006, these Russian researchers founded the journal History and Mathematics. So you can see from the title, it's devoted to apply mathematics to the study of historical events and processes. And then in 2010, Peter Turchin founded the journal Cliodynamics, which describes itself as a journal of quantitative history. So we can see from this that people have been developing theories of historical change for a very long time, and there's also been an acceleration in recent times. And I'm now going to talk through this in a bit more detail, and I'll divide it into 5 phases. So the first phase will be the classical and medieval period. And this was a time when people tended to think of history as in terms of decline from a golden age. This was particularly true in medieval Europe, where people, when they look back to the past, saw the Roman Empire, a mighty empire that had unified half the continent and had built road systems and impressive monumental architecture that the societies of medieval Europe could not aspire to themselves. So from their perspective, it seemed that the world had been better in the past, more advanced in the past, and there had been a decline. So theories of history tended to talk about decline and decay. Then the next phase I'll talk about is what I'll call grand theory. So this is the time here from the 18th century to the 19th century. And this was a time when Europe was spreading out into the wider world, the voyages of discovery, and also making great progress in science and in technology. So now the idea was that history is actually all about progress and optimistic, and that the future would be better than the past. And indeed that this was even the purpose of history, was all about human progress. And then in the 20th century, things changed a bit again. People became interested in the concept of civilizations. So I'll call this phase the civilizationists. And now people were thinking that Western civilization is not the pinnacle of history, not the ultimate goal of human progress, but is actually just one civilization among many, and is likely to decline and fall like all the others. And I think there are a number of factors in this. Firstly, as Europeans went out into the world and came to countries like India and China, they realized that these countries had been more glorious in the past and were in decline when Europeans reached them, and had become weak and non-innovative and stagnant. And also archaeologists were digging up the remains of ancient Egypt and the civilizations of Mesopotamia. And so again, that was a reminder that mighty civilizations could end up as nothing but rubble buried in the ground. And also the colonized countries were gaining political consciousness and challenging European rule. And also it seemed that the great age of geographic and technological discoveries lay in the past. Innovation and discovery was slowing down. So for all these reasons, I think people in the West particularly were becoming less confident about the future of Western civilization, and thinking that it might end up going the same way as all these other civilizations seem to have done. And then the last phase I'll talk about is what I'll call the new wave, which is from the end of the 20th century up to today, where people are taking very mathematical and scientific approaches to history. And one of the things driving this is that we now live in a world of computers and the internet and of data. So data has become much more readily available and much easier to manipulate through electronic means, and that has made it possible to study these things in a more quantitative manner. And the fifth phase, well, it's not really a phase, but I'll talk separately about the Russian school. So Russians have played a big part in the development of theoretical history and continue to do so today. And I think it would be helpful just to separate them out as an issue in their own right. And it would be useful talking through this history of theoretical history, because the characters and concepts that come up will be ones that appear during these lectures. And so it would be useful if we have an idea of who they are and where they fit into the grand scheme of things. So let's start with the first phase. I said the classical and medieval era of theoretical history. One person then that we can start with is Aristotle. Now he's actually before that timeline that I just had. He was in the 4th century BC. But he came up with an important idea that we will use, which is that you would expect history to go in cycles, because there's no perfect way of organising society, and people tend to react against what they see. So they see problems with society and they correct those problems, but in correcting the problems they introduce new problems. And so the next group of people will try and correct those problems, and eventually they'll end up back where they started, and this whole cycle will repeat. So yes, Aristotle had this explanation for why we should expect history to be cyclical. Then there is Polybius, who I mentioned. So he's the 2nd century BC, and his theory of political cycles he called anacyclosis. And according to that, he said that governments can be characterized according to whether they are benign or malign, and according to whether the rulers, there's just one ruler, whether there's rule by the few or rule by the many. And so he said we have, for example, in the benign rule by the one is what he call kingship, and malign rule by the one is tyranny. And then benign rule by the few is aristocracy, and malign rule by the few is oligarchy. So a few people are ruling society for the benefit of all, a few people are ruling society for the benefit of themselves. And then benign rule by the many is democracy, and malign rule by the many is what he called ochlocracy, meaning rule by the mob. That should be many. And he said that states go through this in this particular order. They evolve benign to malign and then down. So tyranny causes some people to say, well, this, we've had enough of this tyranny. We're going to set up a better form of rule, and few people will be in charge rather than having just one tyrant. And when the oligarchs have been exploiting society too much, goes up a demand for democracy. And when that evolves into mob rule, according to Polybius, some individual person comes along and says, that we've had enough of this, I'm taking charge. And they restore sort of order and tough rule. And this then evolves back into benign kingship, and then you go through the cycle again. So that is Polybius's idea of anacyclosis. And that has been, influential on later theoretical historians. Now, it wasn't just in Greece and Europe that people were thinking about history and thinking about it in terms of cycles as well. In China, you have Sui Yan or Su Yen, various spellings and pronunciations of it. And he was in the 4th century BC. And he was also thinking of history or politics following a cycle. In his case, he suggested that Chinese dynasties go through a cycle corresponding to the Chinese elements of earth. Let me just check. I think earth, wood. Yeah, earth, wood, metal, fire, water. So successive dynasties corresponded to one or other of these, and they had the corresponding characteristics. And he also suggested that you can tell when a dynasty is declining by certain signs that are special to each phase. So, for example, when the Earth dynasty is declining, you will find giant earthworms in the soil. So you can imagine that his theory is probably not one that we're going to be drawing on very much, but nevertheless it shows that people were thinking that there was a pattern, a cyclical pattern to history. And another person around this time in India is Khaldun, also known as Chanakya, so this is still 4th century BC, with his work, the Arthashastra, which was about government and good government, the practice of good government. But he advanced a theory of the state, suggesting that states come into existence because of people's demand for order. And the state provides that order. And he suggested that taxation is legitimate because it's what people pay for that service from the government of providing order in society. So he was talking in terms of the social contract. Then we have going forward about 2,000 years almost, Ibn Khaldun, who I mentioned in the timeline, and his introduction, or as it's called in Arabic, the Muqaddimah, his introduction to his world history. And as I said, it involves a cycle of dynasties in terms of 4 generations. So according to Ibn Khaldun, a dynasty is founded by a very tough leader. So the first generation consists of the tough founder of the dynasty who, comes in with his army and his allies and takes over a society. And then the second generation is less warlike because the society's already been conquered, so they're kind of domestic, but they're also still pretty fierce, having learned from the previous generation, so they're also quite despotic. Then the third generation is very soft and just interested in pleasure seeking. And then the last generation is simply weak and ineffectual. And at this point, a new tough person comes along and says, well, this dynasty is so weak, it's not keeping order in society, it's just serving itself. We get rid of that and we start with a tough founder again of a new dynasty, and so it repeats. And another key aspect of Ibn Khaldun's thought was that it's not just the dynasty, but there's also change in the whole society. There's what he called asabiya. Spell it in various ways from the Arabic, but asabiya, which basically means social cohesion or loyalty and commitment. And he suggested that in the first generation, the whole society is loyal behind the founder of the dynasty. But as time goes on, the people of society become more selfish, more interested in themselves and less committed to the dynasty and to society in general. So society becomes more fragmented and selfish. And so when someone comes in to overthrow the fourth generation, nobody cares. And the new founder with his new cast of loyal followers takes over. And these ideas of Ibn Khaldun remain very relevant. They were used by Peter Turchin. So some theorists of the decline and fall of empires talked about the fact that as empires expand, their costs tend to increase faster than their revenues. And so they explained the fall of empires in terms of, because the costs overtake the revenues, when that happens, the empire collapses. Well, Peter Turchin pointed out that if you actually do the mathematics of this, it doesn't predict collapse, it predicts just a stagnation. When, as the empire expands, it eventually reaches the point where the costs match the revenues, and at that point it can't expand, but there's no reason for it to collapse because the costs are covered by the revenues. And so he said that what we need is an extra ingredient, and that is Ibn Khaldun's idea of asabiya, so that although the empire has expanded and costs match revenues, it doesn't just stay stable like that, because within the empire, where it's peaceful and soft, asabiya is declining. So that loyalty of the empire's citizens is also diminishing. And when it diminishes too much, it can no longer sustain this balance of costs and revenues. And so that is a point at which it collapses.
A century later, Machiavelli combined Ibn Khaldun's dynastic cycle with the anacyclosis of Polybius.
Okay, so that is the classical and medieval era. Okay, so let's talk about the era of grand theory, which is the roughly the 17th to the 19th century. And first we can start off here with is Giambattista Vico, who produced a book in the 17th century, The New Science, which was his attempt to provide a science of history, rather like the science that Newton had demonstrated in the physical sciences. And Vico was still believed in the idea of decline. So in his theory, history starts from vigour and moves towards decadence. But in the 18th century, we had the French Enlightenment and the idea of an age of reason. People were now coming to believe in the power of humans to understand and master the world and to make the world better. So now people were starting to see history in terms of progress and advance rather than decline. And a couple of figures that I mentioned are Anne Turgot and Anne, he was actually a man, but his name was Anne, and the Marquis de Condorcet. So these people were interested in the laws of economics, economic laws, and technological progress. And the causes of technological progress and the effects of technological progress on society. And their work in economics, you know, some of it has stood the test of time and is part of the foundation of modern economics. Then a little bit later in the 18th century, we have Immanuel Kant with his book, work, Idea for a Universal History. So he was presenting a grand theory of history, and he suggested it's all about progress, and that is, history has a purpose. We're moving towards a better world. That is, what history is all about. It's not just a random collection of incidents. There's a pattern to it, a theme to it, a driving force. And then around the turn of the 18th, 19th century, we have Hegel. And for Hegel, he particularly emphasized that history is about the growth of the idea of freedom. So people's thirst for freedom is what drives history. And he said that history has gone from, despotic government to rational government. That's what he saw when he looked at the world of his day, that governments had become more law-based and more rational-based, and were concerned with the welfare of their populations rather than just, somebody set themselves up as ruler and it was all about them. Hegel is also the person who said that one thing we learn from history is that people never learn from history. Then in the early 19th century, I'll put early 19th century here, we have Comte, who I've already mentioned. So this is, 18th, 19th century there for Hegel. We're 18th century here. This is 17th century. So early 19th century, Comte, taking advantage of the growing availability of government statistics.
The word statistics originally meant data to do with states.
And so he emphasized, rather than these grand theories that were based largely on the thinker's imagination, he was getting down in the weeds and looking at empirical data, actual statistics, and trying to find patterns in the data. And he called his approach positive philosophy. Or, his approach to philosophy was a positive philosophy. So known for short as positivism. And then moving more towards the mid-19th century, this was a time when people were becoming aware of evolution and also the great antiquity of the human race and the antiquity of human society, and developing some understanding of the earliest prehistoric societies and what they were like. So people were starting to develop theories trying to account for this long-term social evolution. And one name to mention is Lewis Henry Morgan, who suggested that the human race has gone through 3 stages of social organisation, which he called savagery, barbarian, and let's say savage, barbarian, and civilized. And some societies remain in the savage or the barbarian stage. Now, these ideas, of course, modern historians have very much moved away from, saying, you can't go around calling people savages and barbarians. But although these ideas or these terminology has perhaps been rejected, the ideas keep coming back into theoretical history in other forms and in different disguises. Largely because there's quite a reasonable logic to them. So when we're talking about savage society, we mean society whose highest level of organisation is the family. There's no social structure above the family. And in barbarian societies, we talk about societies where there's no form of social structure above the village. The village is the highest level. And then with civilized societies, we're talking about societies where you have cities as the highest level of social organisation. And what this particularly means is that with the family, everybody is related to everybody else. In the village, everybody knows everybody else. And in the city, neither of those things is true. People are mostly mutual strangers. And so these very different conditions lead to very different social forms. Another person at this time is Herbert Spencer. He was very interested in the whole idea of evolution, and he sort of closely studied Darwin's work, and he invented the term the survival of the fittest. And where Darwin was concerned with evolution and the survival of the fittest in biological organisms, Spencer was concerned with it in societies, seeing how the strongest societies and the strongest social institutions would tend to flourish. And he also saw social evolution as part of a bigger process, more abstract process of evolution. So social evolution sort of comes after biological evolution, which itself comes after cosmic evolution. So firstly we have the evolution of stars and galaxies, then we have the evolution of life and leading to humans, and then we had evolution in human society. So, and he saw this as one great process. And today that would be called big history, and people are still taking that approach. So Herbert Spencer would be a big historian, and he suggested that the theme of history is, the theme of evolution, all kinds of evolution, is the main theme is the development from the simple to the complex. And by this particularly he meant a move from homogeneity to heterogeneity. So what do we mean by that? In simple systems, all the components are very much the same, but as they evolve forwards, the components become differentiated into different types, and they also become interdependent. So if we think about human society, the earliest simple societies that live by hunting and gathering, everybody in the family has much the same role and has much the same skills. They can go out, they can hunt, they can gather berries. But as we move forward to our societies, we now have many different roles. We've got, the dentist, the doctor, the train driver, the teacher, all sorts of different roles. And not only are they differentiated like that, but they're entirely interdependent. A doctor couldn't survive on their own. They need the dentist, and they need the train driver, they need the farmer, they need the teacher. So there's this greater complexity consisting of more different parts and more connections between the parts. And big historians, still talk in those terms about the growth of complexity. Pretty much a contemporary with Spencer was Henry Thomas Buckle, another British historian, who set out to write set out to develop the laws of history. He wanted to do for history what had been done in the natural sciences by people like Newton, and he came to realise that the task was too big for him to produce these laws of history, and in any case he died young, so he didn't get much of a chance to do it. But he did produce a book, The History of Civilization in England, that gave him an opportunity to set forward some of his ideas. And what he was particularly concerned about was technology and how it creates human liberation. So technology liberates people. So he's bringing in some of the ideas of Hegel, for example, that it's historical change is about increasing liberty, and he saw technology as the key driver of that. So we might think of how the printing press, when it came in, caused an explosion of availability of information. In the past, books were written out by hand by monks, and they were controlled by the church, and there were very few of them. With the printing press, suddenly books were much more freely available, and they were available in the secular world. And so people could start to read for themselves and think for themselves, and this helped to break the power of the church over people's minds and over society. That's the kind of thing that Buckle was arguing. And yes, so the printing press in its day was like the internet today in terms of breaking monopolies on information. And when it broke the power of the church, it led to the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism. So he's seeing technology as driving these changes. Then, of course, we have in the mid-19th century, again, Karl Marx. And he saw history as well as going through certain phases in which he emphasised the character of the age was determined by how people made their living. So we would start off here with foraging, hunting and gathering, trapping animals, picking berries, and then came agriculture, when people made their living by working in the fields. And then in Marx's own day, the factories, industrialization, how people made their living. And then he thought this would carry on to a future where people would be freed from the need to work for their living by new technologies. So today we might say the world of robots and AI, when they will do all the hard work and we'll be able to live in luxury. And so this is, very ancient times. This is the Middle Ages. This is the modern world, and this is the future world. And Karl Marx also suggested that what drives this change is that in each phase there is a conflict between winners and losers. There's a class that is winning and a class that is losing. So there is a class struggle between the winners and the losers. And that is what propels society forward to the next phase. So eventually, this conflict creates a demand to produce a better way of life and takes us forward to the next one. So again, with agriculture, in these societies it was a conflict between lords and peasants, and then that led to the rise of factories, and then in our own day there's a conflict between the capitalists and the working class. And because Marx saw this as leading to this wonderful world, he said that back in these days this was a happy world of what he called primitive communism, where people lived in families, family bands, and they had an attitude of share alike. The world was quite equal. But then in this world is a world of inequality. But in the future, there is this world of advanced communism. Let me write that properly. So advanced communism in the future. And naturally, because he saw this as a wonderful goal to move towards, he was very keen to encourage the process by encouraging and exacerbating class conflict, which will take humanity forward to that utopian world of the future. And then towards the end of the 20th century, towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, we have, worth mentioning, two key thinkers, Emil Durkheim and we're now moving a bit away from this era of grand theory to more detailed looking at the societies of today. And Durkheim, in his book on suicide, discusses statistics that show that the rate of suicide in a country is very much the same from year to year. So for any person who actually commits suicide, their decision to commit suicide is a very personal thing. It must be based on their particular circumstances and their particular mood. But nevertheless, even though each suicide is a very personal individual thing, somehow at the level of society, the rate remains fairly constant. And this suggests how, even though humans can have independence of action and have personal agency, there can nevertheless be patterns or structure at the level of society as a whole. So Durkheim was addressing this contrast between agency and structure in terms of driving history. Is it our actions or is it impersonal historical laws? He said, well, they're kind of both can happen. Even though people are taking very personal decisions, somehow it creates an overall pattern. And he pointed out further that the rate of suicide is lower in Roman Catholic countries, where suicide is very much frowned on, than in Protestant countries, where it's not associated with the same kind of stigma. And So he was suggesting that although each person's decision to commit suicide is very personal, it's also influenced by the social milieu. So if you're in a Catholic country, if you're brought up Catholic, your behaviour is influenced by that social milieu. And of course, the social milieu is created by us because it's our behaviour that creates a milieu for other people. So he's exploring how historical laws and individual actions can somehow be reconciled, and it's our actions that create the laws and the laws that shape our actions in some way, which is not to say that it's completely resolved, but it's coming a little bit out of the fog, how these two things can both be true together. And then the last person I'll mention is Pareto, Vilfredo Pareto, who, like Comte, was very interested in government statistics, and he showed, among other things, that if you plot the number of people, let's put that there, the number of people who have incomes of different sizes, there's a lot of people with low incomes and a few people with large incomes, and it follows a very clear mathematical law. If this is a logarithmic scale, so that would be 1,000, 110, 1 on that scale. But on a logarithmic scale, it is a straight line. And so this is an early clue that, again, there can be in social behaviour, in historical behaviour, very precise laws like those we normally expect in the physical sciences, the natural sciences. And Pareto also said that humans are irrational. They don't act based on reason, they act based on their emotions. And this is what makes them predictable. If people did think things through logically, then it would be kind of hard to pin down exactly the decisions they might come to. But because they act on their gut, on their emotion, and those emotions are quite predictable, then we can find these patterns. And so from our perspective as theoretical historians, we can say people are irrational, and that's what makes our job possible. Okay, so the next stage is the civilizationists. And this is now referring to the 20th century. And as I said, this was a time when people were starting to think that maybe Western civilization is not the be-all and end-all, but is actually just another civilization that can decline like the other civilizations that we see, either those archaeologists are digging out of the sand or the former civilizations in the Far East that we have colonized. And first person in this area is Spengler, Oswald Spengler, with his book, The Decline of the West. So for Spengler, all civilizations, he had half a dozen civilizations that he was comparing, all civilizations have gone through the same cycle that he characterized in terms of the seasons of the year. So from spring to winter. And he suggested that they all last roughly 1,000 years. And according to his analysis, Western civilization, at the time he was writing in the early 20th century, was just entering its winter period. And he thought that the Western civilization would come to its end round about the year 2100 or maybe 2200, but was coming to its end. And another key aspect of his thought was that Western civilization is not as many people think, just a continuation of classical civilization, of Greek and Roman civilization, but is a thing in its own right that came into existence round about AD 1000. So that is why it has now it's a definite lifetime, just like the classical civilization did before. But that classical civilization came and went, and Western civilization is a new thing that will also come and go. Then, a little later in the 20th century, Arnold Toynbee, who I mentioned in the timeline, with his, I think it's 12 volumes, study of history, though you can get condensed versions. He took over the idea of civilizations, but otherwise he tended to disagree with pretty much everything Spengler said. He didn't believe in this rigid cycle or 1,000 years. He identified mechanisms that drive civilizations forward, but not a definite timetable. And in his mechanism, he identified various moving parts of a civilization. So, one of his key ideas was that civilizations come into existence and are driven forward by a process of challenge and response. So an example would be in the ancient Near East, climate change and also poor agricultural management techniques were leading to the decline of soil quality. So farmers were finding it harder to grow enough crops. And this was the challenge. And the response was then the development of more complex societies. And this is what led to the rise of ancient civilizations in the area of Mesopotamia. That would be Toynbee's argument. And Toynbee also pointed out that the people who drive civilization forward are actually very few. He called them the creative minority. So people of a civilization may think, oh, we're members of this advanced civilization, we are therefore advanced. But Toynbee was saying, actually, it's only a very few people who create the civilization and move it forward. Most people are just, also rans within that. And another of his concepts was that of the external proletariat, by which he was thinking of, say, the barbarians, the Germans who invaded the Roman Empire and led to its collapse. Or perhaps I shouldn't quite say that. Not necessarily, that's a bit simplistic. Didn't necessarily lead to its collapse, but changed the Roman Empire as they came in, a more vigorous people, the external proletariat. So, and there's more, and when we come to this, the module on cultures and civilizations, we'll go into Toynbee's theories in a lot more detail. But you see the point that he has these various ideas, and he claimed to find these in all civilizations. So that, in Western civilization, he'd identify a certain creative minority, the same in Indian civilization, the same in Chinese civilization. And similarly, there would be an external proletariat in each example. And then a little bit later in the 20th century, Carroll Quigley. He actually died only a couple of years after Arnold Toynbee, who died in 1975. But he was a younger person, and he tried to make these ideas of Spengler and Toynbee more scientific. And he had a book, The Evolution of Civilizations. And if you look at that, you'll see maps and charts to try and put these ideas on a more scientific basis. And also he developed and built on them. So I think that whereas Toynbee had certain stages, Quigley added further stages to his Civilizations. And the last, not person, but group of people to mention in the mid-20th century is the French Annales school, named after their journal Annales, which emphasised then that they were interested in history in terms of patterns, not events. So that is theoretical history. We're not looking at events like the Crimean War, we're looking at patterns in war over the long term. So yes, they were interested in the long term processes of change. And they emphasized that theoretical historians need to practice total history. So historians need to take into account geography, because you can't really understand historical change without understanding the role of geography. The societies of the Mediterranean, the fact that there was a Mediterranean as a sea, as a conduit for trade and transport, was very important to their development. So you need to consider geography. You also need to understand the laws of economics, because history is subject to the laws of economics. You also need to study, say, linguistics, because linguistic differences can be important in the way history develops. So everything really comes under the ambit of theoretical history. It needs to be total. And the Annales school, nothing very particular of that what they came up with, perhaps has fed into the new wave, the modern wave of theoretical history, but certainly the philosophy, the attitude, these ideas. We're interested in patterns, we're interested in processes, and we're interested in a total approach. Next phase, which is the new wave of theoretical history. And this is where it's becoming more self-consciously scientific and more genuinely scientific. And as I suggested, the fact that we've got computers and the internet and we live in a world of data is what's driving this ability to be scientific about historical change. We're starting to get the numbers that we need. Now, there were some precursors, although this is sort of the late 20th century to today. There were some precursors. So one would be Nikolai Rashevsky, who wrote a book called Looking at History Through Mathematics. That was in the 1950s. Well, the clue is in the name. He was trying to show how we can build mathematical models to explore historical processes. And another person is Robert Carnero, archaeologist, and he was particularly active in the 1960s and 1970s. He developed a theory of the state, how states arise, the so-called circumscription theory. And he also looked at technological change. He collected statistics on the way that technologies accumulate in societies, and particularly how there were certain preliminary technologies and then late technologies that build on those, and how technology has to evolve in a certain order in societies. So he was applying formal and quantitative methods to thinking about these things. Then in the 1970s came world system theory. Which is particularly the work of Immanuel Wallerstein. And crudely, this can be seen as an application of Marxism to the world as a whole. So in Marxism, there's the idea of a conflict between the capitalists and the workers. Wallerstein said, well, this operates on the level of the world as a whole, that there's a rich core, capitalist core, the Western world, and then there is a poorer periphery which provides the labour and the raw materials for the lifestyle of the core, and that the same kind of conflict can arise between core and periphery, and that is driving world historical evolution forward. And after Wallerstein, there came along two people, Barry Gills and Andre Gunder Frank, who said, well, no, Wallerstein sees all this as starting around the year 1500 with Western capitalism taking over the world. But actually, this process has been going on a lot longer. It goes back to the Bronze Age. There was a core and periphery back in the Bronze Age, but in those days the core was in the Middle East and the periphery was Europe. And what's happened is that the core has moved around, not that it's suddenly come into existence with Europe, but it has moved into Europe over the last few millennia. And the corollary of that is that it can move on from Europe and to somewhere else, and Europe may find itself becoming the periphery again. Then in 1979, there was a book, Transformations, Mathematical Approaches to Culture Change. And this was primarily an archaeology book. It was primarily by archaeologists and thinking about archaeological phenomena. But you can see again that in the title, Mathematical Approaches to Culture Change, 1979, showing how we can use mathematical models to explore archaeological processes. And they were particularly interested in catastrophe theory, which was, quite big in the 70s. I mean, I was around in the 70s. I remember catastrophe theory coming in the news and people talking about it. I think because it had quite a cool name, catastrophe theory. And what catastrophe theory is about is that the way systems can change, they can be changing gradually, and then you go over a cliff, or small step forward in the past just led to small changes, but with that final step, when you go over the cliff, it leads to a huge change. And this seemed to be a possible way we can start to think about social collapse, that a society can just be changing slowly and just kind of pushing the boundaries, and it doesn't realize it's actually getting close to a cliff edge, and then it goes over the cliff edge and suddenly there's social collapse. And another aspect of that is that when you've gone over that cliff, you can't just undo what you've done. If while you're still up here, if you can take a step forward, you can take a step back. It's very easy. But when you've gone over the cliff, you've taken a step forward, you've now fallen down here. You can't just take a step back. You've got a huge climb to get yourself back to where you were. So things become much less reversible. And so, with environmentalism, which was coming in the 70s, it seemed to be like a kind of warning to our world that we may think we can, just keep pumping the oil, but maybe we're going to go over a cliff edge. So this is why these things caught on to some extent in that time. Another couple of books, in 1988, two things came out. Joseph Tainter, with his collapse of complex societies, and Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And both of these were concerned with how empires, societies rise and fall. Tainter mainly from an archaeological perspective, Paul Kennedy from the perspective of modern history, the recent history. And both had a very similar explanation, which is the one I've already discussed, in terms of as empires expand, their costs increase faster than their revenues. And when costs outstrip revenues, you're bankrupt and you collapse. And as I said, Peter Turchin showed that it can't just be that. We need to add other ingredients to that theory to make it actually work, to create this catastrophe. Another very important book that is influential on the modern people working in theoretical history is Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel, with the subtitle A History of Everyone Over the Last 11,000 Years. And Jared Diamond explains in his introduction that what inspired him to write this book was what he calls Yarley's question. Yarley was a friend, an informant or a friend of his in Papua New Guinea, a Papua New Guinea native where Diamond spent time doing field work. And Yarley one day said to Diamond, why is it that you Western people have all this stuff, have all this prosperity, whereas we in Papua New Guinea, we don't have that? How did this come about? And Diamond says his book is an attempt to answer that question. So in his title, you can see three of the key factors he identifies: the fact that Westerners had developed guns, the fact that they had diseases that were mild for them, but that other populations around the world had not been exposed to, and so weakened them terrifically, and also steel, or standing for kind of advanced technology. But Diamond also identifies geographical issues or biogeographical issues, as he is, a biologist. So the fact that in the ancient Near East there were plenty of grasses that could be domesticated and turned into crop plants, and there were plenty of animals that could also be domesticated. And whereas in Africa or in other parts of the world, particularly the Americas as well, that those things didn't exist. So farming, the invention of farming, was much harder and therefore naturally took longer. And also that because of the way that Eurasia spreads out from east to west, it made it very easy, once some of crop plants have been discovered, to spread along a line of latitude, because you've got a line of constant climate. Whereas in Africa, it was much harder for things to spread because it was having to go up and down, so through changing climates. That's the kind of thing. So he was again suggesting how we can look at the last 11,000 years of history as not just a random series of events, but a pattern. And the reason the West is wealthy and Papua New Guinea isn't is not due to some special cleverness or some chance, but has been driven by these patterns and processes in history. Then in the 1990s as well, we have Jack Goldstone. I've mentioned his structural demographic theory, or some people call it demographic structural theory, or other names. And his book was Revolution and Rebellion in the Modern World. And he developed an index of political stability index, which had certain sub-indices that contributed to it and that he could measure quantitatively. So, yeah, showing how something like the outbreak of the French Revolution, we can see it in the numbers. It's not just something we can only understand verbally. And then we come on to Peter Turchin, whose book I mentioned, Historical Dynamics, and he's founded the journal Cliodynamics, and he has himself written, hundreds of papers and many other books, and has been a real driving force in getting the modern scientific mathematical approach to history going. And he used Goldstone's ideas, and he also used the ideas of Ibn Khaldun and some other thinkers, and built on them, showing how they can be made even more mathematical than they were. And then there are many other people who we will be meeting as we go through this course with their papers and their ideas, of the last couple of decades. And lastly, I'll talk about the Russian school. And the first person to mention is Leo Tolstoy in the 19th century. Now, Tolstoy, of course, is best known as a novelist, but in his book War and Peace, he was also concerned to present his theory of history. And Tolstoy's point was that Napoleon often didn't really know what was happening in his battles. He was in his headquarters, but what determined the flow of the battle was the actions of the junior officers and the troops that were actually on the ground. And so Tolstoy says, how could Napoleon be said to be running the battle when he didn't really know what was happening? And his broader point is that the flow of history is not determined by these great figures like Napoleon, but depends upon the actions of the ordinary anonymous people on the ground. And so he called history the swarm life of humanity, and was saying that it is something that we all participate in. All our actions contribute to the flow of history. Then the next person to mention is Nikolai Danilevsky, who wrote a book called Russia and Europe in the late 19th century. And I think what was motivating Danilevsky was a feeling among some people in Russia that Russia always seems to be a kind of poor cousin of Europe. It's always lagging behind. It's somehow more authoritarian, less enlightened. Inventions are taken up earlier in Europe, and then eventually Russia catches up. And Danilevsky was saying, no, it's not that Russia is a poor relation of Europe. Russia is different from Europe. It has a separate identity. And the way he did that was to say that there are multiple civilizations in this world. So he identified a number: India, China, Europe, and he said that Russia is another separate civilization. It has the characteristics of a separate civilization. So it's not a poor cousin of Europe, it's an entirely different thing. And Russia has a bright future. So his work there on civilizations and how they have a historical trajectory is what inspired Oswald Spengler to analyze history in terms of civilizations, and for him to think about Western civilization, and then through him Tolstoy and Quigley, the other people who worked on civilizations. Then another great Russian theoretical historian is Peterim Sorokin, who was born in Russia but moved to the United States and became a professor of sociology at Harvard University. And his great work is Social and Cultural Dynamics, which is a 4-volume book full of masses of tables of statistics. Sorokin was interested in changing social and cultural ideas. So, for example, in art is sometimes more religious and sometimes more secular. And Sorokin looked back to the time of the ancient Greeks onwards and scored art in terms of whether it was more religious or more secular, and found these waves in the attitudes towards art. And then he did the same for other fields like philosophy, science, literature, music. And he also looked at wars and the changing incidents of wars for different societies. And I think one of the things that drove Sorokin was that he had lived through the horrors of the Russian Revolution. He was imprisoned and sentenced to death at one point before he managed to escape to America. And I think he was trying to show to himself that the trauma of the Russian Revolution was nothing out of the ordinary from the perspective of the grand sweep of history, that other societies had been through similar disruptions. And so that Russia didn't need to feel, that it was particularly violent or particularly repressive. It was just a moment in Russian history that was very much like similar moments in other histories of other societies around the world over the last two and a half millennia. Then we come to Lev Gumilev, whose parents were both Soviet dissidents, and because his mother was the poet Anna Akhmatova, and because of the distant nature of his parents, he himself was under suspicion. He found it difficult to get academic jobs, and he spent a lot of time in gulags. And during this time, he worked on his theories of history, and one of his key ideas was that of ethnogenesis, which is about the creation of ethnic identities, national identities. And I think what drove this is that Russia has been sandwiched between East and West and has been tramped over by the great steppe empires, the Mongols, Genghis Khan, and was for a long time a conquered people. But Russia came out of this with a strong sense of its own identity. And Gumilev was interested in this. How does this sense of identity grow? And I suppose he was thinking it grows out of this kind of adversity and challenge, and led Russia to not only develop an identity, but go on to build its own empire. And Gumilev's ideas have been taken up by historians studying the fall of the Roman Empire and the emergence of the nations of modern Europe. So they're interested in how do national identities like the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Italians, the French, the Belgians, how did these grow out of the aftermath of the fall of and disappearance of the Roman Empire? Ethnogenesis. And towards the end of his life, Gumilev was rehabilitated thanks to President Gorbachev and his glasnost, and Gumilev became, a respected figure, a television personality, and he died in 1992. And his passing was very much recognised by the Russian media and so on. So it was kind of a happy ending. He was vindicated at the end of his life. The next person to mention is Sergei Kapitsa, who was a Russian scientist and also a television personality, so a bit like a sort of Carl Sagan figure. And he wrote a book, or he wrote several books, but he wrote a book, Paradoxes of Growth, in which he talked about theoretical history. And one of the things he investigated in that book was this demographic hyperbola of world population against time, and he came up with a theory to explain why it looks like that. He died in 2012. And lastly, I'll mention two theoretical historians who are very much active today, Leonid Grinin and Andrei Korotayev. And I mention them in the same breath because they often collaborate, though they also do work independently. One of Grinin's key ideas is that of production principles. So a bit like Karl Marx, he suggests that the human race has gone through several stages which are defined by the way that people made their living. So the hunter-gathering, the agrarian societies, the industrial societies, and then the modern scientific cybernetic societies, as he calls it. But he's more scientific than Marx, suggesting that these stages have divide into a definite pattern of sub-stages, which have always played out in the same way. So he sees a mechanism there that takes history forward, and how these play a role in the creation of the overall social structure. And he's done many more things beside that. That's just an example, but that's certainly one thing that has been quite important in his work. Andrei Korotayev, I mentioned his work, Social Macrodynamics, which was looking at this and developing models to explain that, and then going on much further beyond that, using that to sort of develop some models and then exploring their further implications. And that's in 3 volumes. And he's also looked at other things, like, for example, he's interested in religion and culture and how religion affects the incidence of political corruption. So sort of the cultural explanation of political corruption. He's also looked at mythology and how people's myths can tell us about how they might have been related in the past, if there are similarities in different people's myths, and therefore about what they can tell us about the migration of people. And both these researchers have been very important in the foundation of journals. They have founded several journals and yearbooks that are outlets for theoretical history papers, their own and those of many other people.
Peter Turchin was also born in Russia and moved to the US as a young man.